Oh, hi everyone. Back at it again. This time I'm gonna just kind of go through um, the subject guide, the syllabus around macroeconomics, and again have a think about where we're likely to see these questions and what style. Maybe kind of discuss some real world examples as we go along. It's likely to be a longer clip again, so feel free to skim through to where the topic that might interest you is. I'm just going to work my way sequentially through the subject guide. Okay, so again, key concepts. You know, if you think back to your macro IA, most of you looked at economic well-being as one of your key concepts in macro. Again, feel free in the paper 1 part B in the macro question, if it's relevant to throw in the economic well-being key concept, please do. But again, keep it simple. One sentence or two, just to acknowledge that the key concept's got some meaning in that question. It just says there different schools of macroeconomic thought. So for us, we know that the distinction there is classical versus Keynesian, or um, you know, monetarist versus classical, and Keynesianism. On the old syllabus or the previous syllabus, they did kind of um, suggest, often sometimes they were explicit, they actually said using the Keynesian multiplier or the Keynesian diagram for you to respond in terms of the part B. My thinking is that you would typically use the monetarist view, especially if you're close to full employment. But if your real world example or the actual question signifies there's a significant recession happening, then there is absolutely more scope for you to use the Keynesian analysis, so the Keynesian aggregate supply curve. So it just depends on the actual question being asked and or your choice of real world examples. Okay, 3.1, just national income accounting. So you're looking at all the calculations there around nominal GDP, real GDP, GNI, the price deflator. I'm pretty sure you're going to get something on question 2 on paper 3. It seems to be a regular thing now that you'd be required to undertake those calculations. Again, I'm not 100% sure what you did on paper 2 on Friday, but there'd be no doubt you're going to get this kind of stuff. So the calculations are very straightforward. You should be able to do them. Just understand the difference between nominal and real variables. Okay, so nominal variables will, obviously take into account both changes in output and inflation, whereas real variables you negate the impact that inflation has. Percentage change in the variable, so don't forget the formula, the consistent formula used for percentage changes, just the current value minus the previous value, divide it through by the previous value times 100. Bread and butter. It should be bread and butter stuff for you guys by now. But yeah, I'm pretty sure you're going to get something on paper 3, most likely in that second question. Business cycle diagram. No, kind of heard that you might have had that on paper 2, but you could see it again on paper 3, or you may wish to use it on paper 1 in the macro question if it's relevant. So I'll skip through that. Okay, now this is important. The appropriateness of using GDP or GNI, that was on the May paper. There's a possibility that you may get that as either a paper 1 part A, or as it says there, AO3. So that suggests, that it could be the part B question on paper 1. So you're looking at whether or not GDP or GNI is, a good measure of economic well-being. So, you would say the good things about it, as it says there, you're able to compare things over time. You're allowed to make comparisons between countries, so that's an advantage of those statistics. But there are, many limitations with using GDP or GNI. They're listed in the textbook and the study guide. I won't go through them all, but to me, it's often a question that people don't look at or don't prepare for. But honestly, if you did get it and you prepared for it, it's really straightforward. It's not too difficult. Um, just remember this has application to global, particularly development. Sometimes GNI is a much better measure than GDP for the developing world because we know that in the developing world, a lot of their people go work overseas and send money back home through remittances. So, sometimes GNI is a better measurement than GDP when it comes to the developing world. Um, a little bit of alternative measures, AO2. So my thinking there would be maybe if you did not see that on paper 2, they could slide it in somewhere on paper 3 as a 2 marker. But having said that, given its sequencing in the syllabus, it could easily be, the counterclaim to the top bit, this bit here, because you could just say, you know, if you kind of work out that GDP and GNI aren't great measures of economic well-being, there are alternative measures or indices, and the happiness index, the happy planet index, could be used. I wouldn't say too much. If anything, I would just know what they are. As I said, maybe it's a 2 marker at a stretch, or you want to build it into your response based on GDP or GNI being not the perfect measures of well-being. Um, aggregate demand, aggregate supply. You need to know that. Obviously, it's like your demand and supply analysis for macro. Um, know the 4 components. Know what the key determinants of those 4 components are. If any of those determinants change, is it an increase shifting it to the right? Is it a decrease shifting to the left? I'm pretty sure you know that by now. So that's going to be embedded in paper 1, part A. They might actually tell you to talk about certain determinants changing, and then you might have to kind of explain what happens to aggregate demand and therefore what might happen to real GDP and the price level, etc. Same with short run aggregate supply. Remember, that's more of a monetarist view. Remember, in macro, the short run is defined as a period of time where the price of goods and services can vary, but the price of inputs remain fixed. And so the things which may cause the SRAS to shift specifically are the costs of the factors of production, so any change in resource prices, in particular wages and energy prices is a great example there, and any changes in indirect taxes would also cause the shifts. The alternative views, remember with the monetarist view, you've got the short run and the long run aggregate supply curve. The Keynesian view, you've also just got a standard aggregate supply curve. You've got that kind of inverted L shape. So at low levels of output, the AS curve is relatively flat. And then as you approach full employment, it starts to go vertical. Think about the output gaps, both inflationary and deflationary. Remember, you represent them on the horizontal axis, the difference between actual output and full employment output. And then have a think about, shifts of the LRAS versus the Keynesian AS. What are the determinants there that cause them to shift outwards or shift inwards, depending upon what you're looking at. Okay, and there's the determinants there on that page there. I'm not going to go into that because I'm pretty sure uh, you know all that. Obviously, remember that unemployment at full employment is not zero. It implies that cyclical unemployment is zero, but you will have some structural, seasonal, frictional unemployment happening there too. Um, Equilibrium in the Keynesian model. Basically, sometimes that suggests that recessionary gaps or inflationary gaps can persist for a significant period of time because wages and prices are sticky or not fully flexible. Whereas we know in the classical monetarist view, the system is self-correcting. Wages and resource prices adjust up and down freely, so any output gaps will be quickly eliminated by movements in wages and resource prices. Okay, so it rests on that assumption about wage and price flexibility. I think we did teach you Say's law. Remember, the monetarists believe that supply creates demand, so you're never going to have deficient demand, whereas the Keynesians believe demand creates supply. So there are epochs or periods of time when, when we do have deficient aggregate demand, and that provides a justification or a role for the government to step in at the macroeconomic level. 3.3 macroeconomic objectives. Yeah, just remember the difference between potential growth and actual growth. So, potential growth is when the PPF shifts outwards or inwards. Correspondingly, that would cause your LRAS and SAS curves to shift inwards or outwards, depending on what's happening. Actual growth can be represented by, you know, a movement closer to the frontier, or if actual growth is declining, it would be a movement away from the frontier. And correspondingly, in terms of the LAS curve, actual growth moves you closer to full employment. Slower actual growth or negative actual growth will take you away from the LAS curve, as in your actual equilibrium point. Okay, but you guys know all that. It's pretty easy. Um, okay, so consequences of economic growth. Again, this is something they can ask you on paper one, part A. Um, just some of the consequences of economic growth, the good things about it, but also too, some of the negatives. So, rapid economic growth in particular might impact sustainability or the quality of the environment. It could have an impact on income distribution. So we know from the other day, sometimes growth is not inclusive. It doesn't necessarily lead to people being better off. Maybe a small group of people are made better off, but others miss out. So just those general limitations. Um, Unemployment. Okay, how do we measure it? The unemployment rate. So remember, the unemployment rate is the number of people unemployed divided by the labour force times 100. The labour force includes both people who are employed and people who are unemployed. Remember, you've got to be actively looking for work. So again, could be a part A question. Some of the difficulties with trying to measure unemployment. So remember, the discouraged worker effect, people who give up looking for work drop out of the statistic. People who are underemployed are considered employed. So remember the unique feature in Australia where you just work 1 hour a week and you're considered employed, and that makes the unemployment figure look healthier than what it should. The causes of unemployment, so cyclical, structural, seasonal, and frictional, know all those. In terms of the diagrams and calculations, as I said, be able to calculate unemployment rates from data. Minimum wage to show unemployment. So we know that minimum wage is an example um, of a price floor, and so that leads to a surplus in labour. Josh was making rude signs at me. So that's showing, the level of unemployment. Weirdly, the textbook treats that as a type of structural unemployment. Um, yeah, I don't quite get that, but anyway, we just accept that and we move on. Labour market diagram, it's important to use. So, you know, either a decrease in demand for labour or an increase in demand for labour will impact on the wage, could cause it to go up or down depending upon the relative shift in the demand. And it also could be the supply of labour. So if you think about it, immigration, if we get a boost in immigration, that increases the supply of labour. If we have declining birth rates, that leads to a decrease in supply of labour. And Japan and South Korea are amazing examples of countries where their populations are declining. I've already mentioned natural rate of unemployment, so that's a sum of structural, seasonal, frictional. Again, that's not implying that unemployment is zero. It means cyclical unemployment is zero. It says there you can use the recessionary or deflationary gap to show cyclical unemployment. So if you want to show cyclical unemployment, just your standard ADAS with the temporary equilibrium or short-run equilibrium below full employment. That gap between actual output and full employment output is indicative of cyclical unemployment. Whereas if you want to show structural, that minimum wage is something that, as I said earlier, the IB says it causes structural unemployment. Costs of unemployment. In the past, there has been Part A questions where they ask you to talk about the costs of unemployment. Remember to classify it or understand the difference between personal costs, social costs, and economic costs. That's a really good thing to do, and that would be a pretty easy question. I know we have given you that test I think it might have been in Year 11, Term 4. So, just reread your study guide, have a look through your notes, be able to discern the cost to its particular classification. Inflation, obviously a biggie, given that the entire world has gone through a period of significant inflation. You can see their calculation HL only, a weighted price index using a set of data. Bingo, you're going to get that probably on question 2 on paper 3. You would be given weightings for the products, and you have to construct a CPI or the Consumer Price Index, and then maybe work out the inflation rate from looking at the percentage change in the CPI. In terms of diagrams, no demand pull and cost push inflation. Please use that terminology in your paper 1 part B question or part A question. Be able to show those diagrams, demand pull, rightward shift of aggregate demand pushes up or pulls up prices, whereas cost push inflation, we know aggregate supply contracting. And then, of course, the situation where you've got deflation, that could be, something you might have to contend with. Big topic because it's current. So when you think about it, these exams were written 12 to 24 months ago, and we know that period coming out of the post-pandemic situation, inflation was an issue. Measure the inflation rate using CPI. The limitations of CPI and measuring inflation, again, that was on the May 25 paper. Whether that's on paper 1 or paper 3 for you guys, know what some of the dramas are in measuring CPI. Remember, it's a typical basket of commodities which may not represent, particular people. In Australia's case, the CPI is measured in the capital cities, and that might not be indicative of the true inflation people experiencing, in country towns or remote areas. So, have a think about, skim read some of the limitations of CPI in the study guide, because that would be a pretty easy, straightforward question if you got it and you're prepared for it. The cost of high inflation, okay, so the uncertainty that creates for both households and businesses. Households will be reluctant to spend, and they might put their money into savings, and so that kind of decreases consumption. Same with businesses; they'll be reluctant to invest, so that could have demand side pressures in the short term. So aggregate demand might decrease. Obviously, that might impact aggregate supply in the medium longer term if businesses for a period of time do not wish to invest. The redistributive effects, who wins, who loses from high inflation, especially if you're not planning for it. So if the actual inflation rate turns out to be higher than what people plan, um, it's a problem. The damage to export competitiveness, that was an actual question, I think, last year, a paper one, part A. So if your inflation rate is higher than your trading partners, that means your exports are less attractive, imports are more attractive, and that causes your aggregate demand to be lower as your net exports decline. Causes of deflation, any kind of change in AD or SRAS, so in a detrimental manner, will bring the price level down. And yeah, okay, we like lower inflation, but you don't want it too low because it may indicate that your economy is not travelling too well and it may lead to a period of deflation. Disinflation, so remember disinflation's just prices rising. They're still positive and rising, but rising at a slower rate, which is up until the latest reading on the CPI is what we've been experiencing in Australia. And then you can see the cost of deflation. I won't go into that. That's pretty self-explanatory. Debt, interesting, because that was on the exam. When was it? Last year or the year before last, 2 years ago. It was a paper one, part A question. Doesn't seem to have the urgency as what it did maybe 18 months ago, but it's a very small topic. It's one of the macro objectives that we're interested in. So, it doesn't hurt to know it, especially its connection to fiscal policy and also, again, economic development. We know, the poorer regions of the world, um, debt is often unsustainable. Um, you know, there's constantly people in Australia whinging that Australia's public debt is way too high. It's about $1 trillion, but by global standards, it's only about 35 to 40% of GDP, which is very low by global standards. So remember, that's the key measurement, the percentage of GDP. Remember the relationship between deficit and debt. That could be a paper 3 question. So budget deficit is just the annual budget being the spending is greater than the revenue collected from tax. The debt is just the accumulation of previous budget deficits, right? And then you can see some of the costs of having high government debt, which infiltrates into economic development there. Debt servicing costs, the impact it has on your credit rating. So, America's constantly having to argue for better credit ratings. Australia has an amazing credit rating system, AAA. The impact on future taxation, so think about it from intergenerational equity purposes. So you could throw that in as a key concept. That more debt today just means you're putting more pressure on future generations to retire or pay off that debt, and then the impact that might have on future government spending. Right. To me, potential conflict between macroeconomic objectives, really important for paper 1, part B. We know how important it was for your IA. Most of you did monetary policy. We're looking at cutting interest rates to stimulate the economy. The danger that inflation might reignite, and that is something we're currently experiencing. So that would be a great real-world example to use. Um, in the exam, if especially if you get a question on monetary policy or fiscal policy. Remember the 5 objectives, low and stable inflation, low unemployment, solid economic growth, equitable growth or inclusive growth, and sustainable debt. Um, you know, And I keep telling you, the Chinese acrobats spinning the plates on the sticks, you think you fix up one, but you damage the other. So, mandatory. Whether you're talking about, um, be it supply side, policies, demand management through monetary and fiscal, whatever policy you're examining to fix a particular macroeconomic objective, there's a really good chance that you're upsetting or making another particular macroeconomic objective worse, right? That would be the mandatory evaluation paragraph. Um, Definitely you need to talk about that. And as I said, there's some great current ones given that, most countries around the world have gone through a period of inflation where they tightened uh, monetary policy or contractionary monetary policy to slow down inflation. That led to slow growth, higher unemployment. Now as we're cutting interest rates, the danger is that growth gets too strong and inflation reignites, and that kind of thing. Now that gives you scope to bring in the Phillips curve. Okay, so remember the Phillips curve is the short-term trade-off between unemployment and inflation. That usually happens when aggregate demand is bouncing around. Um, you don't necessarily get the trade-off if you get a supply-side shock. What you'll find is you'll get stagflation. Um, so, whenever, there was a time there where the Phillips curve was being directly or indirectly asked for in the macroeconomic question. So keep an eye on that. But, the buzzword there is trade-off. If you see trade-off in um, the question around inflation unemployment, that's telling you straight away bring in the Phillips curve to talk about it. Remember, there's a short-run Phillips curve and a long-run Phillips curve. There's, the, the, the monetarist school argues that over time the economy naturally gravitates back to full employment and the natural rate of unemployment, and there is no trade-off. Um, so, strong possibility to talk about that. Okay. Um, okay, so you got there AO3, high economic growth, low inflation, high economic growth, environmental sustainability, high economic growth and equity. So they're the counterclaims, the difficulty in balancing all your macroeconomic objectives and the potential for conflict between meeting, you know, the four or five of them or the five of them. Okay, equality and equity. Remember the difference between the two. Equality, everyone gets the same. Equity is more about what's fair. What do we mean by economic inequality? Unequal distribution of income or an unequal distribution of wealth. Um, we're currently seeing that in Australia now. The boomer generation and my generation, Gen X, we're likely to be a lot more wealthier than younger generations, um, because I guess the rules of the game have been stacked in our favour at the moment with all the tax laws, and we own property, and I mean it's going to be more difficult for you guys to get into the property market. Measuring economic inequality, so don't forget the Gini coefficient there, and um, how you would display how the Gini coefficient is calculated using the Lorenz curve, and obviously be able to sketch the Lorenz curve. I think you had that on your paper too the other day. And just show the distribution of income and possible changes in distribution of income if something changes. So, later on when you're mucking around with progressive taxes and welfare payments, that can help alleviate an unequal distribution of income, and that pushes your Lorenz curve to be closer to the 45-degree line. Says there in black, construction, okay, HL only, a Lorenz curve from income quintile data, so they could give you that on paper 3, and you have to construct a Lorenz curve. Most of you can do that. The only thing to be aware of there is the labelling. So remember, it's cumulative percentage of households and cumulative percentage of income. there, and quintile is 20%, 40%, 60%, 80%, 100%. Meaning of poverty, difference between an absolute relative poverty. I believe that relative poverty people didn't quite understand. Absolute poverty is, basically people don't have enough to survive. So, the images that we see on TV or the internet where, we see little kids starving and adults doing it incredibly tough in terms of malnutrition and having clean water, that's absolute or extreme poverty. Relative poverty is when we think about poor people in Australia, they're not kind of earning the average income or what we deem to be a reasonable level of income here. So it's relatively poor rather than absolute poor. Um, Measuring poverty, you know, paper 3, 2 markers. If they weren't on paper 2 already, I know MPI has been a a definition on paper 2 in previous years. As I said, I can't see you getting a direct question on that on paper 1, but it might be something you might mention as a side note in your response. Most likely on paper 3 if they were going to explicitly test you on that. Um, Causes of economic inequality and poverty, including, okay, you can read through that. If you did get a question on paper 1, part B or part A, that's likely what looks like A because it says AO2. You know, that's your response. So if it might be looking at some of the reasons why economic inequality or poverty exists, and they're the little things that you would talk about there. I won't go heavily into that. Okay, role of taxation in reducing poverty, income and wealth inequalities. Yep, progressive taxes. So that just means as you earn more, your marginal rate of tax increases. Regressive taxes are the ones which seem to impact to a greater extent on middle to low income households. Proportional taxes are when everyone pays the same rate of tax. Okay. Average and marginal tax rates, you may be asked to calculate that on paper 3. Given the indirect tax rate, the amount of indirect tax paid from a given level, amount of expenditure, calculation HO only, total tax and average tax rates from a set of data. The first few years, both May and November sessions had those calculations. I got a feeling we haven't done it in the last 2 sessions, which makes me suspicious that it might rock up tomorrow. So I would certainly know how to calculate the amount of tax that someone owes based on their income levels and the taxation system they face. There's plenty of previous papers which go through that. But also too, that little trick there where they might ask you to work about the total amount of tax you pay, which would include not just say your income tax, but maybe any indirect tax or GST or VAT that someone has. So there's a little trick there. Make sure you read over that because my gut is telling me you might see it tomorrow. Right? I know the difference between average and marginal tax rate. Average tax rate's just T divided by Y. Marginal tax rate is the change in T divided by the change in Y. Okay? And it says they're from a set of data. Yeah, I don't know. I just think you're going to get it. Yep, and other things you can do to reduce inequality and poverty. I think we gave you a question around this space on the mock. Don't be surprised that equity is such a big concept, big global key concept for the IB. Don't be surprised if that's your macro question. So some of the things we can do to alleviate poverty and income and wealth inequality there, put greater investment in human capital. And again, this can apply to policies that can help economic development. So this can be used for global unit as well. Indonesia is an absolute great real world example. The new president of Indonesia is putting in a lot of expenditure on improving education and health outcomes, um, all around Indonesia, because they reckon the high levels of poverty there have impacted on health, which ultimately, comes back and haunts the economy because people aren't healthy enough to work, etc. Transfer payments, so, whether it's unemployment benefits, sickness benefits, uh, you know, they're just remember that it's just a redistribution of income or wealth from one party, a wealthier party, to a less wealthier party, just to help them, buy basic goods and services. I mean, the developed world will obviously Brisbane Roar have scored in the background. Um, there can be targeted spending on goods and services. I think I might pause there because it's a little bit loud. Anyway, just that intermission there with Brisbane Roar getting a goal against the Newcastle Jets. So apparently it's 1-0 up at the Sunshine Coast, and there's a decent crowd there. So yeah, there can be targeted spending on goods and services. So especially, we know that's one of the strengths of fiscal policy too, that you can direct your spending to targeted groups of people who need it, rather than kind of spraying the money everywhere on people who may not necessarily need it. Universal basic income, possibly. You can talk a little bit about that because it's a bigger thing in Europe and the United States. There are some countries and cities in the US that are experimenting with it. This could be a bigger issue, especially if AI technology really starts to bring about greater levels of unemployment. It might be something um, that is more likely to happen universally. Uh, I think someday, maybe certainly not in my lifetime, and maybe not in your lifetime, we won't be working. I mean, robots and AI will be doing everything, and we will just be receiving a universal basic income. But I mean, that's not going to happen in our lifetimes, but it will happen. Policies to reduce discrimination. Okay, so again, racial or gender discrimination that occurs, if we put in policies to provide opportunities for everyone to succeed in life, much better. As I said, whether that's based on race, religion, or gender, that's a good thing to do. And to provide minimum wages, so to protect people on low income. And you could talk about that in Australia too, with the Fair Work Commission over the last few years, have been indexing the minimum wage to at least the rate of inflation, maybe a little bit more, because people's real incomes were falling behind, and usually those people have the least amount of power in the labour market. So something good to talk about there. I feel like I'm rushing through this. That's because I'm getting tired of doing it. Okay, real world issue two. So this is, again, this is where I think if you're going to get a question, a nice question on part B in the macro unit, I think this is where it'll come from. You know, given all these five objectives that we try to achieve at a macroeconomic level, there's a role for government, and we've got to assess or evaluate how effective these policies are in achieving the objectives. So remember, I've always said to you, five objectives, three main arms of policy: supply side, monetary and fiscal. How can we use a mixture of these policies to hit the five goals, right? That, that's what we're looking at. So the degree of intervention, and then how successful or effective. The question might be, how effective is fiscal policy? Is monetary policy the best policy to use in fixing this particular issue, whatever the question is? Like I keep saying to you, it might be asking about monetary policy, and so you would spend a half to two-thirds of your Part B response telling us how monetary policy should work, and then the strengths and weaknesses of using monetary policy, any circumstances where it may not work well or where it may work well, and then you would bring in an alternative. So could fiscal or supply side policy, or a combination of those two, be used to achieve the goal better? Okay, monetary policy, all right, basically controlling the money supply in order to determine the interest rate. Okay, we've talked about, the mechanisms or the tools of monetary policy. You can see there, OMO, minimum reserve requirements, the bank's lending rates, base rate, discount rate, quantitative easing. Quantitative easing's not so sexy now. We're getting into quantitative tightening, so not really, you know, probably not really relevant for your test tomorrow. The goals of monetary policy, low and stable inflation. Don't forget targeting. So in Australia and most of the Western world, central banks will target the inflation rate at around 2 to 3%. Uh, they're not. They might be concerned with unemployment and growth too, but over time they want to bring that inflation rate back into its target zone. As it says there, low unemployment, reduce business cycle fluctuations. So we want to experience nice steady growth around the trend rather than having that roller coaster ride. Um, Provide a stable economic environment for long-term growth, in particular to encourage businesses to invest. And then an external balance. So keep an eye on, what's happening to the current account or trade balance and what's happening to the level of foreign debt too. That might be something that's in the back of the mind of central bank governors. All right, demand and supply, determination of equilibrium interest rates. You know that. You did an IA on that. I'm not going to go through it. Real versus nominal interest rates. The real interest rate is just the nominal interest rate minus the rate of inflation, and you may have to calculate that on paper 3. I think it might have been on the May exam. So possibility 2 marker. Expansionary and contractionary monetary policies to close recessionary or inflationary gaps. Again, you did your IA on this, just shifting, the AD to the right or to left depending upon what type of output gap you're experiencing. And then you get into the effectiveness of monetary policy. Okay, some of the constraints there. Limited scope of reducing interest rates when close to zero. So, in that low interest rate environment, you know, around just before COVID or after the GFC and then post COVID, like it's what we call the liquidity trap. Like during those periods where interest rates are that low, it's usually because people are not feeling very confident because of, recession. So irrespective of how low those interest rates are, people aren't going to go out and borrow money. They just couldn't be bothered. There's too much risk involved. And the same thing too, banks aren't necessarily going to lend money out to customers because they may not feel people who borrow money have the capacity to pay back the money. Yep, and that follows there with the consumer and business confidence not being high. It might not be suitable. The strengths of monetary policy, they're incremental, so you can bring them up slowly, you can bring them down slowly. They're reversible, so if we go up too quickly, we can easily bring them down next month. They're short time lags in the sense that it doesn't take long to make the decision to change the interest rate, but obviously we know there is a lag in terms of by the time the interest rate changes and impacts the economy, it can be anything from 6 to 18 months. But the implementation is pretty quick because you don't have to go through Parliament and it's just a matter of the board. Like if you look at Australia's case, the RBA board makes a decision, the the governor makes an announcement, and in that instant, the RBA dealers will inform the market, and the market adjusts straight away. But how it feeds into the real sector of the economy, so if you think of the transmission mechanism and the channels, that could take a bit more time. Fiscal policy, again, the interesting thing about fiscal policy, remember, it has both demand management aspects as well as supply side. Um, so fiscal policy, source of revenue, taxation, sale of goods and services from state-owned enterprises, and sale of government assets, or what we call privatisation. and then you can see the expenditures, their current expenditures and their capital expenditures, and then transfer payments, which are usually the biggest expense of governments. In Australia's case, it is, and also we have a growing issue with the NDIS, which is costing us a hell of a lot of money because it's been growing rapidly. The current government has kind of brought it down a little bit, but there's been a drama there, and of course, there's been rorting. So, they're little real world examples you can bring in. The goals of fiscal policy, pretty similar to the goals of monetary policy, but they've got a little bit more potency in dealing with the equitable distribution of income, because we know monetary policy is a pretty blunt instrument, whereas we know with fiscal policy can be targeted and you can really assist people who really need help. Expansionary, contractionary fiscal policy, the diagrams there, ADAS curves shifting, AD curves in particular shifting when you're looking at demand management. But, whether you want to adopt the Keynesian model or monetarist model depends upon the situation that you're looking at. Keynesian multiplier, may have heard it was on paper 2, on question 2, not sure. I will know tomorrow when I have a look at the exam paper. But this was certainly, it has been on previous paper 3 exams. You've got the simple multiplier there, 1 over 1 minus MPC, or the more complex one where you got 1 divided by the marginal propensity of the leakages. If we go over here, be able to calculate it, the effect on GDP of a change in injection, investment, government spending or exports. So they might actually give you some MPC values or, the other propensity values, and then they might say, government spending or export spending increases or decreases by this amount. What will be the impact on the overall level of GDP? Well, it's just the change in expenditure times the size of the multiplier. Remember, the multiplier works both ways. Okay, so it works in an expansionary way and in a contractionary way. If you get a question on fiscal policy on paper 1 and you are leaning towards talking about a Keynesian curve, you can bring in the multiplier there and show how the AD shifts in 2 ways, like the exogenous amount, the original amount of spending, and then the induced amount brought about by the multiplier. That's always a little nuance you can put in to score more highly. I think, I know we've talked about this in class before. I think most modern day monetarists would argue that there is a multiplier there. They would just see it as being weaker, as those economists who are more Keynesian in their views. But, whether you want to talk about that or not, it's up to you. Effectiveness of fiscal policy. So again, most likely, if they do talk, the question is on fiscal policy, how effective it is in fixing that macroeconomic objective. These are your bread and butter when it comes to evaluation, and you would align them with the real world examples. Political pressure. So remember, in a democracy, fiscal policy's got to go through Parliament. So in Australia, it's got to go through the House of Reps, and sometimes that's pretty smooth because in Australia, usually we have one party that dominates the House of Reps, but in the Senate, it can be blocked. So that would be a good real world example if you can think of an Australian case where, the House of Reps have passed something, but the Senate, sends it back down. Time lags. Again, it's usually going through Parliament is the main time lag, but sometimes, the actual policy or project may take a little bit of time to eventuate. Sustainable debt. So we know whenever the government spends money through fiscal policy, it puts pressure on the budget, could force it into deficit, and then that deficit over time leads to debt, and the debt grows and it may become unsustainable. So there's that conflict of objectives happening again. And then HO only content crowding out. Yeah. For all this quantitative easing and modern monetary theory, crowding out is less of an issue, but you'd have your market for loanable funds diagram, and you would either show an increase in demand for loanable funds, which pushes up interest rates, or a decrease in supply of funds, which would push up interest rates, and then that has a feedback loop back into aggregate demand if interest rates rise because the government is borrowing so much money. So there's your AO4 diagram there showing crowded out. The strengths of fiscal policy, you can target specific economic sectors, government spending effective in deep recession. So fiscal policy tends to be much better than monetary policy in a deep recession. So if you think about what we went through with the COVID pandemic in this country, probably JobKeeper, JobSeeker payments made a bigger difference to pulling the economy out of recession than what lower interest rates did, right? Because we've already argued that when you're in the recessionary phase of the business cycle, people are reluctant to borrow money to spend. But if you give people money through significant tax cut or government cash payments to households, they're more likely to spend it than monetary, although it can be debatable. Automatic stabilisers, absolutely know that because it's HO only. So again, it could be implicit as in the sense that you could bring it in as a part of a conversation on paper 1, part B, or there might be a 2 or 4 marker, maybe a 4 marker on paper 3. So how do progressive taxes work? Well, in a boom, it takes a little bit of heat out of the economy because you're paying more tax. Benefits go down. So again, there's less spending in the economy. But in a recession, because people's incomes are lower, they're paying less tax, so that keeps more money in a circular flow. And then receiving unemployment benefits obviously gives you amounts of money that you can spend on basics, which kind of injects money back into the system. Supply side economics, you can see there the goals there. Long-term growth by increasing the economy's productive capacity. So we're trying to shift out the LAS, but remember, whatever we shift out the LAS, we can shift the SAS out as well. The whole purpose of it is it's a reaction to stagflation. So, if you think about the 70s and 80s with the oil shock or the supply side shock that we've experienced during the pandemic and post-pandemic period, or the ageing of the population. The whole idea is to shift the SAS-LAS curves out, in particular the LAS curve. That will lead to more growth, lower inflation, and greater employment. So you're not getting any of the negatives. How we do that? Improve competition efficiency, so expose businesses to greater competition. Reduce labour costs by making the labour market more flexible, maybe removing minimum wage laws or lowering minimum wages. Keeping inflation low in order to improve competitiveness, so, makes your exports cheaper, imports more expensive by, manufacturing a low inflation rate. And maybe providing some kind of concessions, tax concessions or subsidies to businesses to invest in R&D or innovation to, lead to reduction in costs. Right, that could be market-based. So you can see the market-based ones there. Deregulation, privatisation, trade liberalisation, anti-monopoly. But realise these all work, but they all come there will always be a negative, okay? So deregulation, cutting red tape, green tape, might have damage on environment or equity outcomes for workers. Privatisation, you're just going, possibly from a public monopoly to a private monopoly who's more likely to rip off consumers, or you're selling a government asset that brings in income every year, you're selling it off for one big hit. Trade liberalisation, The removal of tariffs, quotas, subsidies, export subsidies will make things more efficient, but obviously those firms, that industries which don't have a comparative advantage will basically die off, and that will lead to unemployment and structural unemployment in those sectors. Labour market policies there, so reducing the power of unions, reducing unemployment benefits, abolishing minimum wages. You can sketch all those diagrams in the labour market that show, more people employed. But the issue there, of course, will be equity. Okay, so there's your conflict objectives. You improve efficiency, or might lead to greater employment, but those people who have jobs are the working poor, and so they're not necessarily better off. Personal income tax cuts, so the old supply side, give lower taxes to people in order to provide incentives for people to work more, save more. How effective they are is very debatable. It also too means that in the short term, the government is likely to collect less tax revenue and could put pressure on their debt, leading to unsustainable debt. And, often what people do is if they get significant tax cuts, often they just work less hours. They might do less overtime, might find a cruisier job. There's no guarantee that lower taxes will lead to a greater incentive for people to work more and work harder, etc. Cuts in business tax and capital gains tax, yep, that could work. The argument there is that often businesses use their own funds, to finance their investment rather than go to a bank. So if you cut company taxes and capital gains tax, then the business has more profits that they can invest in their business. So they're market based. You could get a question on, discuss a view that market-based supply side policies are effective, and you would say this is where they're effective, this is where they're not effective, and then offer the alternative. Like I keep saying, there are alternatives that you can offer, and they can be like interventionist policies there. So where the government plays a heavier hand, there's a greater degree of intervention. So around education and training, Australia's a great example. The Albanese government, the 2 terms, or the second term, first term, the government's put in more money into apprenticeships. I think going to TAFE is free. Remember, they've just announced a pause or a reduction in student debt for university students. They're looking at changing the prices of degrees through the HEC system. So Australia's got a lot of good examples there. Improving quality, quantity, access to healthcare. I've already mentioned Indonesia. Some of the other Asian economies are doing that too now as they get wealthier. The government's got more money to put into that area. Research and development. So the government, the Made in Australia Act recently, trying to get more to develop comparative advantage in certain key industries in Australia, green energy, critical minerals, rare earths. The government's playing a big role there. Provision of infrastructure, the roads, the rails, the transport, the hospital systems, port facilities, airports. Vietnam is a fantastic real world example to use. So you can look up Vietnam and see what the communist government in Vietnam is doing to try. They've announced some really big expenditure packages. Same with Malaysian government. They're working with Singapore to create an industrial park on the border there because, Singapore's just a tiny little island off the edge of Malaysia, so they're working well together to, provide infrastructure and work on a common industry policy. They're all things to good. Understand that fiscal policy in the short term is demand management, so shifting the AD out to the right or left depending upon whether it's expansionary or contractionary. But also too, if you look at these interventionist policies. Some of them come through the fiscal side of things, and they will have supply side effects in the medium to longer term. Um, so keep that in mind. Both curves could be shifting. How effective are supply side policies? The usual ones, the market-based ones, there's equity issues, time lags, they might not work straight away, vested interests, so sometimes, the supply side policies are angled towards particular industrial groups. The problem it might have on the environment, could lead to the destruction of the environment, or dirty rivers or dirty oceans. I mean, you think of salmon farming in Tasmania. Both the state government in Tasmania and the Commonwealth government were a bit too lenient, and we've led to a lot of problems in the salmon industry in Tasmania and the impact it's had on the environment and the locals. Could also say the same thing there with South Australia. Interventionist policies, really expensive. Okay, time lag. So you think of all the infrastructure projects, that are going on around Brisbane and the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast. So forever seem to be working on that Cross River Rail project. The Bruce Highway or the M1 to the Gold Coast and fixing that up all the way to the New South Wales border. Takes a long time, costs a lot of money, it's slow work. We've also got the Brisbane Olympics coming, so, in the next, 7 years, we're going to see a lot more infrastructure projects and the nightmare and the mess that's going to create for locals living here until those things finally get built and working properly. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there. If it was me, macro would be probably the question I would do, especially if they do talk about monetary, fiscal, and supply side policies. I would absolutely nail it. Um, you know, just remember that if it's on one of those policies, then you've got to bring up the other policies too, because they may be a better way or more effective way, or in conjunction with the other policy, they might work better. So that's a good angle to discuss there. Um, Part A's, good chance that they could be around some of the limitations of the measurements of the objectives. So, the CPI limitations, the GDP, GNI limitations, the unemployment limitations. Yeah, that could be it. And there's always a possibility, that the Part B question is about equity or the distribution of income, because, as I said, that's one of those big global concepts that the IB thinks is incredibly sexy to talk about. Anyway, that just gives you some food for thought. Again, hopefully um, it's useful for you. I'm not sure if I've got the energy to do global. I'm really starting to struggle, and it's Sunday night, and I really need to kind of have an early night and get ready for the working week. But you you can do the same for global. You can go through, look at the AO3s, look at the AO2s, the AO4s. That gives you an indication what might be paper one, paper three. But look, I hope the videos that I've done over the last couple of days have been useful. Um, we're thinking of you tomorrow. We understand, you've gone through a lot of pressure, but we know we have every confidence you're going to do well. We're incredibly proud of you guys. We love you. You're like our second family, so do really well. Okay? Good luck, and I should see you tomorrow. Give me a thumbs up if you've liked the video too. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.